A question that's been popping up regarding the iconic arcade machine is, with the Pi 4 that it's housing, how does it actually do with Batocera to emulate all different types of game consoles? And over the past handful of weeks and during the Christmas break, I've tested a handful of the different emulators within Batocera, and in this video I'm going to go over what I recommend emulating with the stock hardware in the iconic arcade machine and what unfortunately doesn't emulate so well. So let's take a look. So to start, as I understand, the iconic arcade machine comes with a Pi 4 1 gigabyte computer set inside the actual the control deck of the device. And from my understanding, this is a perfectly suitable emulation piece of hardware when it comes to 2D based games. So in other words, Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, things like the Game Boy Advance or Game Boy Color, the Nintendo Entertainment System, those things based off of the hardware that comes stock with the iconic arcade machine with Batocera should emulate quite well. And 3D games are a little trickier and seem to struggle a bit more, as I understand, just by researching this hardware that's used for the iconic arcade machine. And so anyways, I decided to test out a bunch of different platforms on Batocera, on the iconic arcade machine with its stock hardware. And I'm gonna kind of go through what I think this works really well for and what doesn't appear to emulate so well. So to start, anything that's 2D appears to run incredibly well. So Nintendo Entertainment System, Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, all those consoles seem to run incredibly well. Now, I know that Neo Geo hardware can be a bit trickier in terms of emulating, as some games were quite intensive. So I did also test that on this machine because I am a big Neo Geo fan. And almost every single game that I played using the Neo Geo emulation software through Batocera worked incredibly well. Very smooth, the sound was in sync, everything appeared to function completely fine. Now, moving into more 3D based products or gaming emulators, sorry, this is where things get tossed up a bit. So what I was most surprised to find was the Nintendo 64 appears to struggle in terms of its emulation on this hardware. Now, it seems to be the bulk of games I tried, not just a handful of them. It seemed like almost every game that I tried had very large slowdown, huge issues with audio. In some cases, like Smash Brothers, the slowdown would get so bad, I would argue it's unplayable. For some reason, certain games, and I say select games, did appear to run okay. So like Mortal Kombat 4, for some reason, emulated near flawlessly. Everything else, though, that I tried did not emulate so well. And I was testing a handful of games. I believe I tested about 15, with Mortal Kombat 4 being the only one that actually emulated well using the N64 emulator. Now, this might be a setting that I have. I've only used the stock Batocera settings, so maybe I'm missing something here. But from what my play testing did not emulate so great. What I was surprised to find, however, was that Dreamcast games were the opposite. Dreamcast games appeared to all emulate incredibly well. And the ones that didn't emulate well seemed to have been outliers. There seemed to have been less of the case than the majority of the case. And so I tested things like Power Stone 1, 2, one of my personal favorites, Marvel vs. Capcom 2, SNK vs. Capcom 2. I tested even Sonic Adventure. I tried NFL Blitz. All these games emulated incredibly well, with the exception of one thing. There appears to be a slight issue with the way it processes audio versus the game. What you'll hear is what sounds almost like slowdown while you're playing in the audio, but the games don't slow down. So in other words, the games are running smooth, they're running very well, but the audio for some reason has an issue with maintaining itself. It seems like the audio has an issue processing, And it's not overly pronounced in every game. Some games it's worse than others, but like Virtua Fighter 3, for example, I seem to have had a wildly mixed experience when it came to audio. Whereas with Capcom versus SNK 2, it seemed like you'd get dips and dives where the audio would run really well, and then sometimes it would kind of dip out. So I'm not sure what the issue is there. Again, maybe it's a setting I'm missing. I only use the stock Batocera settings with this, but for the most part, I would argue the Dreamcast games are incredibly playable, and I've been actually having a great time revisiting a lot of games that I haven't had the chance to play in recent years. So I've been very satisfied with Dreamcast. I also did try out a couple other 3D based platforms. I tried 32X, which I guess is kind of just a Sega Genesis upgrade, but I tried a handful of 32X games. All of those emulated incredibly well. Unfortunately, I was unable to get Sega Saturn games working on this device. I'm not sure what the issue was. And I also had an issue getting PlayStation 1 games to run. So again, I'm not sure what the issue is. I'm probably missing something. But as it stands, if you're playing this device for 2D games, almost across the board between Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo, Neo Geo, they all run incredibly well. Again, when I say incredibly well, I've had no issues with any of them. I've had no freezing, lagging, slowdown, or crashes. Whereas you move into the 3D games, that's where this becomes a bit of a mixed bag and might be a consideration if you're looking at purchasing an iconic arcade machine. And I have also been reading it's not ultra hard to swap out the components of the Pi 4 to a Pi 5 or a more powerful Pi 4. So I've heard some people do that to play more 3D games. Again, I'm not gonna tell you I'm versed in that, but it is a consideration, and there's probably some sort of guides on either the Iconic Arcade fan group on Facebook or even here on YouTube on how to do that. But as it stands for the stock hardware, for what this can emulate, I'm actually pretty impressed. And I'm even more so impressed that I was able to play a lot of these Dreamcast games, which I'm hugely fond of, very well, and also be able to play great things like Neo Geo and a bunch of the other classics without any sort of hiccups or problems.